It began with a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby, who proposed that human infants are born with a built-in system for seeking closeness to a caregiver. Not because of feeding or reward, but because proximity to a protective adult was a survival necessity. That system, he argued, shapes how we relate to people for the rest of our lives. His ideas were tested by Mary Ainsworth, who developed an experiment called the strange situation. Infants and their caregivers were observed through brief separations and reunions, and researchers watched what the child did when the caregiver returned. Patterns emerged. Some children were distressed at the separation, then settled quickly when comforted. Some became highly distressed and were difficult to soothe, seeming to both seek and resist contact. And some appeared not to react much at all, showing little outward distress even though physiological measures suggested they were stressed underneath. Then in the late 1980s, two researchers, Cindy Hausen and Philip Shaver, asked an obvious but powerful question. Do adults do the same thing in romantic relationships? They wrote short descriptions of each pattern and asked adults which one best described how they felt in close relationships. And the answers lined up in a way that suggested yes, something similar was happening. That's the foundation. Now here are the 4 styles you've heard of: secure, comfortable with closeness, and comfortable with independence. Able to depend on others and be depended on without either feeling like a threat, anxious, sometimes called preoccupied. Marked by a heightened expectation of abandonment, a preoccupation with whether the other person is really there, and a tendency to seek reassurance intensely when the relationship feels uncertain. Dismissive avoidant, marked by discomfort with dependence and intimacy, a strong emphasis on self-reliance, and a tendency to pull back from closeness rather than toward it. And fearful avoidant, sometimes called disorganized. A combination of both patterns, wanting closeness and fearing it at the same time. So far, this is probably what you already knew. Now here's the part that changes everything. Those 4 styles are not for types of people. Here's what the research actually found. When psychologists ran statistical analyses on attachment data, looking for whether people genuinely cluster into distinct groups, they mostly didn't. What emerged instead were 2 continuous dimensions. The first is attachment anxiety, how much you worrying about abandonment, rejection, or not being loved enough. The second is attachment avoidance, how uncomfortable you are with closeness, dependence, and relying on other people. Everyone sits somewhere on both of those scales. And the 4 famous styles are just names for regions of that space. Low on both is what we call secure. High anxiety with low avoidance is what we call anxious. High avoidance with low anxiety is dismissive. High on both is fearful. They're not boxes. They're coordinates, and most researchers now measure attachment this way, dimensionally rather than categorically, precisely because the box version throws away real information. When you sort people into 4 bins, you're forced to treat everyone in a bin as the same, and someone barely over a line as completely different from someone barely under it. That's not how the data behaves, so why does this distinction actually matter to you? Because it changes what kind of thing this is. If attachment styles were for types, then finding out which one you are would be like finding out your blood type. A fixed fact about you, something to accept and work around. That's exactly how it gets treated online. I'm an anxious attachment, as though it's a diagnosis. But if it's a position onto dimensions, then it's a description of where you currently sit, and positions can shift. You can become somewhat less avoidant, somewhat less anxious. Not by force of will, but usually through experience, through relationships that go differently than you expected, and sometimes through good therapy. Researchers have a term for this: earned security. People whose early experiences pointed one direction, but whose adult patterns moved another. You are not stuck with a label, you have a tendency that can move. Now let me raise something else that I think matters, because it's where the online version does real harm. Somewhere in the popularization of this idea, avoidance became the villain. Avoidant people get described as emotionally unavailable, incapable of love, best avoided entirely. It's become almost a personality slur that framing isn't supported by the research, and it misunderstands what avoidance actually is. Avoidance isn't an absence of feeling. In the original infant studies, children who appeared calm during separation often showed physiological signs of stress underneath. The outward calm wasn't indifference, it was a strategy. A learned way of managing distress when expressing it hadn't reliably brought comfort. That's not a character flaw, that's an adaptation. And treating people as write-offs based on a pattern they developed as a child, in response to circumstances they didn't choose, is both unkind and inaccurate. There's one more honest caveat worth knowing. A great deal of the research linking adult patterns to childhood relies on adults recalling their own childhoods. That's retrospective and memory is reconstructive. It's a real methodological limitation, and researchers openly acknowledge it. So be cautious with any confidence story that maps your current relationship behavior neatly on to something specific your parents did. The connection is real at a population level. The individual story is much harder to prove. So what should you actually take from all this? Not a label, something more useful to questions. When a relationship becomes uncertain, do you tend to move toward the other person, seeking reassurance? Or do you tend to move away, back towards self-sufficiency? That's it, that's the practical core, and knowing your own direction is genuinely valuable because it lets you catch yourself in the moment. To notice, this is my pattern activating, not necessarily an accurate reading of what's happening. And it helps you understand that when two people with opposite directions collide, the pursuit and the withdrawal feed each other. Neither person is the problem, the loop is. That's a far more workable insight than a label. Labels tell you what you are. Understanding the pattern tells you what to watch for. You're not a type. You're a person with tendencies that form for reasons, and tendencies can move. If this gives you a clearer picture, subscribe to Inner Lift because understanding how your own mind works is where most real change starts. And tell me in the comments, when things get uncertain, do you move toward or away? I think you'll find you're not the only one. One last thing worth saying plainly. This is an explainer, not a diagnosis, and no video can tell you what's happening in your particular relationships. If these patterns are causing you real distress, a good therapist can do something no framework on the internet can.